So after the big balance pass changes, which armies are looking like some of the strongest and weakest in Warhammer 40k? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're doing an army tier list roundup, talking through each faction in the game, roughly how strong I'd rank them in Warhammer 40k at the moment, and why I'd rank them where I have. Just over 1 week ago now, we had the big balance update. Really quite a lot of changes across the game, lots of points alterations and a fair few rules as well, plus we've had a few recent codexes too, the Leagues of Votann hitting the meta, plus Codex Imperial Knights getting their release. After those updates, at first impressions it feels like game balance is going to be looking better than it was before. At least when taking one of their stronger lists and playing them well, the vast majority of armies have at least one good strong way to play now, and maybe now more than ever, the combination between army list construction and player skill is far more important than exactly which faction you're playing in game, which is a good thing relative to 40k's history. Having said that, I do think that there's going to be some armies that are going to be a little stronger or weaker than the average. So for this one I thought we'd go through a rough sort of tier list prediction as to where armies might rank up. Bear in mind this is very early days though. There have been new codex entering and some armies got some really quite big significant buffs in the balance updates that maybe aren't quite so obvious exactly how much they're going to boost a faction's power, just at least somewhat. Plus there's all the complexities of what people wind up bringing to tournaments and the overall meta, which certainly feels like it's going to be at least a little bit less knight orientated compared with prior. As a result, I'm sure that a good number of these rankings will turn out to be various degrees of wrong, so take this more as a first impressions. Will be interesting to see how things shake out in reality when people have had time to put the armies on the tabletop, particularly in a more competitive tournament setting. For this one though, I split the armies of Warhammer 40k into 4 rough tiers of power, and tried to subdivide tiers 1 and 2 just a little bit for a bit more granularity. So it certainly predicts there's going to be a whole load of armies in the sort of strong and usable but not crazy standouts sort of balance area for Warhammer 40k have ranked a lot in tier 2 this time round, which is probably a good thing if it turns out to be right. I'd also maybe not get too hung up on rankings. Tier lists are always a bit arbitrary in Warhammer 40k, and some armies could really vary depending on the detachment or the setting that you're using them in. Some tend to dominate at casual, whereas others might be hard to master for the casual player but really excel on the top tables. For this one I'm mainly focusing on faction win rates at grand tournaments, as a measure of sort of an average player's experience with an alright list, as I think it's more relevant to the vast majority of 40k players as opposed to just the select few people who are truly in competition for the tops of grand tournaments on the regular. I'll certainly try and mention a bit of both as we go along though. In any case though, let's jump right in and treat this more of a way to talk about some faction power levels than anything else. First up, and to no one's surprise in tier 4, are the Imperial Agents. On paper a codex just like the rest, but don't really seem to be treated that way from Games Workshop's balance perspective. Nothing's really changed for them in an enormously meaningful way. Their tournament stats aren't particularly meaningful, given that people just don't really tend to play them in competitive unless they want to play Warhammer on hard mode. And again, Games Workshop didn't really help them out in a major way and balance things. They just had the Deathwatch veteran big squads and Watchmasters drop down a little, which admittedly does help a tiny bit. And there were a few changes to character attachments, with Inquisitors and Draxus not being able to join every kill team now. As ever, their core mechanic remains the allied one to ally their units into other Imperial armies, so it doesn't exactly help them out there. The only other sort of core army rule they get is to swap out the Imperial Assassins, so it can tailor them to the matchup. If you want to try and make them work, it's usually Imperialis fleet detachments doing navy units and board control style things. The Assassins are strong, as is Kyria Draxus at that points cost, and if you want damage dealers it's like the Deathwatch veterans, or maybe some Knight allies. Things haven't really changed for them in the way that they can't really deal with tanks or heavies in the codex particularly well, aside from Deathwatch veterans up close. They don't have an army rule, and that seems like a really easy win if Games Workshop did want to help them out in a small way. And even in Codex, the detachment balance is kind of bad, with the Imperialis fleets being by far the best. The biggest issue is that Games Workshop are just ignoring them for balance passes though, and that doesn't seem likely to change anytime soon. I guess they might have some rules updates coming though when Games Workshop get around to releasing that Deathwatch veteran kit from Kill Team Toonworld. Moving onwards and upwards, the ones I've ranked in tier 3 are these ones. These are the armies that are considered slightly weaker and harder to win with in Warhammer 40k currently, at least for the average player. As with last time I made this video, I'd argue that none of these are realistically all that far behind. They all have potential top tournament winning builds, but pre-updates they all had tournament win rates in the sort of 45-46% kind of region, and I don't think that the balance pass changes have done enough to get them out of that kind of area. None of them seem to have been excelling in terms of actually winning grand tournaments either. I'd definitely not say it's all doom and gloom for these guys though, and lower tier armies in Warhammer 40k have certainly had it a lot worse than this in the past. First up, we've got the Grey Knights, who were winning around about 46% of games following their recent Codex release, and one Grand Tournament win with the Banishers detachment. For recent Codex releases, they do seem to have been one of the weakest ones of 2025, at least in terms of raw power. Their faction mechanics have them teleporting on and off the board, which is quite nice for scoring objectives and getting their units where they need to be, and they'll deal damage with close range shooting and melee. Like the Black Templars, they were too close to their codex to have any meaningful balance changes this time around, so they just got the cheaper land raiders that everyone else did. And for stuff that's working for them at the moment, generally people are using either the Warpbane Task Force or the Banishers detachment for some quality melee. Warpbane seems to be doing better than the Banishers on average, particularly with Purifiers and Castell and Crow being quite so effective. I would say both are doing okay, and the first tournament win has been Banishers it seems. The lists tend to rely on the Grandmaster Nemesis Dread Knight datasheet in particular for some heavy lifting, with the big rerolls and discounted stratagems to punch down tanks. Usually good numbers of Purifiers given their damage rules, and then likely some strikes and interceptors to back up and do some objective skirmishing. Overall, it just feels like compared with the rest of the field, their codex just launched with a bit less raw power and might than you might hope for, and there maybe doesn't seem to be great balance between their datasheets. I feel like the Terminator ones and the Purgation squads seem to be rather second tier compared with the Dread Knights and the Purifiers and other power armour. Feels like they could just use a bit more of something. It'd be quite nice to see a boost to the Terminators next time Games Workshop does a balance pass. Before we move onwards and upwards with the tier list, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titans Terrain. They're one option for some easy to store and transport battlefield terrain with their system of folding cardboard tiles. The idea behind their stuff is that you have a battle board made up of 12 cardboard tiles laid out in a grid formation 3x4. That makes a 45 by 60 inch board the right size for 1000 or 2000 point Warhammer 40K, and then each of those tiles basically unfolds and up pops a building. So you essentially have an entire battlefield that can fold flat and store in a box set the right sort of size as a standard size board game. The main unique selling point of this one is that it's quite so easy to store and transport if space is limited. There's not many other terrain sets out there that fold down quite this easily and are quite so compact if either space is limited or you want to take it round to a friend's house. They've got a few different designs. If you want to take a look over their stuff, there'll be links down in the video description. I'll also cycle back to them at the end of the video to talk over a few of the pros and cons. I feel like it does have a few more trade-offs versus other terrain sets out there, so likely won't be the choice for everyone. In any case though, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. With the other factions that might be towards the tail end of 40k power-wise, next up we have the Dark Angels. They've had win rates of around 46% pre-update. So again, the average player maybe being a little bit on the low end of the distribution, and not a whole load of Grand Tournament wins either, just 4 Grand Tournament victories, and plenty of those not with the detachment that most people play in the Wrath of the Rock. It just seems that with the stats they've neither been doing particularly yet stand out, either on an average player or top tournament level. For their core rules, they get the Space Marine Oath of Moment, and certain units either get Deathwing or Ravenwing themes, which might have some additional use depending on detachment. In the balance update, Lionel Johnson got a helpful buff, being able to select 2 of his Primarch abilities rather than 1, and the 2 Ravenwing unique Landspeeders were improved, the Dark Shroud with a points drop and the Landspeeder Vengeance with extra damage. They also got the Space Marine changes as well, which didn't really feel like an overall buff, with a couple of staples like the Blade Guard and Ballistas Dreadnoughts increasing a touch. For detachments, the majority of players have been using the Wrath of the Rock detachment with its durable infantry, a solid melee enhancement and some powerful stratagems. It seems to have a lot of raw might that maybe makes the Unforgiven function a bit more like a stat check army with Deathwing Terminators being hard to kill. And as a result, that seems to have been doing okay, but not really delivering quite as many top placing lists compared with some detachments out there. Otherwise, Stormlance and Gladius still seem to be doing it okay, and the Company of Hunters is alright, and seems to have some good success for a very small amount of players. For their standout units, there tend to be a lot of Deathwing Knights on the board. Azrael's basically an auto-include. Lionel Johnson the Primarch is offering an army list, and I guess might be even more so now after the buffs. Inner Circle Companions have solid damage, if not the defense, of the Deathwing Knights, and some of the Ravenwing things are usable, such as Samael with Outriders, and Black Knights and the Ravenwing Command Squads can do okay, maybe more so in Company of Hunters or Stormlance. For any main issues and weaknesses, it just feels like quite a lot of their character datasheets aren't very good outside of Azrael or the line, and probably could have used a bit more of an increase in strength. Both of the Ravenwing Landspeeders do look more usable than before, and the direct buff to the Lion certainly helps, though given the options he has available, I feel like he's not quite on the same level as say Guilliman when he got the Select 2 ability. Particularly paired with a couple of Space Marine nerfs. Paired with the Space Marine nerfs, I just can't help but think it might not be quite enough to get them outside of this sort of power level, particularly with a few of the other lower tier armies getting some solid buffs. Next up, I've chosen to rank the standard Space Marines here, though I do feel like they're a faction perhaps more so than most, where the power levels of the absolute top most honed armies are going to be very different to the average army that a Space Marine player's actual collection might reflect. Pre-updates, their average tournament win stats really haven't been good, 44%, which is certainly lower than they have been recently, and even at a top level of play it didn't look like there were standouts. Only 5 tournament victories again have been pretty tiny for a really quite popular faction that loads of people play. For their core mechanics, they get Oath of Moments to get big rerolls against one enemy units with the +1 to wounds that differentiates them from the Divergent chapters. And then perhaps slightly surprisingly, given they hadn't really been so standout, they got more of a side grade in the balanced data slate if anything. 6 strong Blade Guard, the Ballistus Dreadnought, 10 strong Jump Back Intercessors and Guilliman all went up. Several of those were really quite common tournament staples as well, so are quite likely to directly affect faction power. In return, they got cheaper Land Raiders, the Gladiator Valiant, Redemptor and 6 strong Aggressors. They've also had Ethon Shan added in with his 85 point cost. That seems like an absolutely great value for him, and perhaps between him and Shrike and their boosted Vanguard detachment, there'll be a fair few people trying to make Raven Guard work rather than Ultramarines. Besides that, it seems the majority of people have been using Gladius and doing well enough with that. Vanguard, Ironstorm, Firestorm and Stormlance have all got a fair bit of good interest too. And for standout units, there usually tends to be a good number of Space Marine cheap 5-man utility units, somewhere between Scouts, Infiltrators, Intercessors and Cursors and Jump Intercessors. Lots of good ones to do objective purposes for all sorts of battlefield roles. Tanks and Dreadnoughts often tend to get used for fire support, particularly Vindicators. I'm not sure if with the nerf to the Ballistus Dreadnought there might be a few other people looking at elsewhere. Maybe some Hellblasters or Eradicators might see a bit more play. For damage combos, there's a few melee ones that are pretty interesting. Blade Guard and Judas Ears have been doing fine. I still think they'll be alright despite a 10 points rise, or you could have a Captain and Stern Guard combo. The Combi Weapon Lieutenant tends to be pretty ubiquitous. A nice tricky units to screen and skirmish and just not die. And then of course there's plenty of units that are better in one detachment, or depending on the chapter that you're using, they're going to be better there or only available there compared with elsewhere. Feels like Ultramarines and Raven Guard both have some good interest now, and Salamanders are solid too. Overall though, for the balance changes, getting a sort of side grade or downgrade for the average Space Marine list felt a bit harsh, particularly coming from a low win rate percentage like they've had. I'll certainly be interested to see if people manage to make Raven Guard work and win some tournaments with their lone operatives and Vanguard. That'd be nice for people that enjoy them, though maybe not super helpful for other Space Marine players out there. Next up, we've got the other launch faction in the Tyranids. Pre-updates, their tournament win rates have been around about 46%, so again a touch on the lower end of the spectrum, and they don't seem to have been doing well on the top tables as well either. Just the 4 tournament victories across the last balance update, which is really quite low for such a widely played and popular army. For their core mechanics, they have their Synapse to help out nearby units, both with leadership and strength, and the Shadow in the Warp for the big turn of maybe less objective scoring and battle shock. And with their unit choices in combination with that, they have been a bit more of a heavy point scoring army. As a result, maybe in theory they might profit from the removal of challenger cards a touch more than some. Besides that though, the latest balance changes didn't change too much. Very slightly cheaper Neurolictors, Morlocks, Turvigons and 10 strong Genestealers. Out of those, feels like the Neurolictor and the Genestealer squads could be the 2 interesting options for more competitive lists. For how they've been winning recently, the Subterranean Assault has been the one that's been doing the best. Win rates are around about 51%. Burrowing Tyranid thing is delivering close range melee or shooting to the right angles. So it seems for people playing that, the faction is doing kind of fine, but for those that aren't, it's a bit more of an uphill struggle. Invasion Fleet's the next most popular and is also doing rather well. Vanguard, Crusher and Assimilation are all fine, but certainly aren't posting quite as impressive numbers recently. After several balance updates and a few datasheet rewrites, the majority of the Tyranids units are at least usable. Exocrines and Tyrannifexes are nice for big hitting damage, maybe some Maliceptors or Norn Emissaries for the front line. Hive Tyrants and the Swarm Lord are nice for command point efficiency. Their lone operatives are rather godly, with Lictors being super efficient, Neurolictors giving them a little bit more competition now. Biovores can rustle up Spore Mines for some nice objective scoring or maybe denial with preventing advances, and usually some Endless Multitudes can sweep some OC onto midfield objectives. There's plenty of Vanguard things that do better in Vanguard Onslaught, like Broodlord and Genestealers. Raveners are just fairly good all around, and nicer in Subterranean Assault for putting down tunnel markers. The Trigon Prime's excellent there as well. And again, there's a few other units that might do well in certain detachments, say maybe heavy melee stuff like a Haruspex in Subterranean Assault. I still feel like there's a general feeling that their datasheets just aren't super strong for the damage and defense though, relying somewhat on scoring and their detachment rules to get them by. And despite on paper struggling a bit outside of the Subterranean Assault, it doesn't really feel like the buffs that they got are going to change anything too meaningful. I'm sure Subterranean Assault will still do fine and still win some tournaments. They might enjoy Knights being a little bit less prevalent in the meta, though it does feel like a few of the armies on the lower power spectrum of 40k got some significant better buffs versus them. Moving onwards and upwards though, next up we've got Tier 2, armies that I feel like are going to be in a pretty good mid-tier spot, and good options to compete at the highest level, with a good player and a strong list. I'd guess that most of these factions might be landing somewhere in the sort of 47 to 51% kind of win rate mark, and all get some tournament victories that have subdivided tier 2 into ones that maybe just feel might be a little bit more on the lower or upper end of the spectrum. They're still close enough that I wouldn't want to put them in different tiers. In any case, for the ones that I felt might deserve to be a little bit lower out of tier 2, perhaps win rates around the 48% sort of level, or fewer grand tournament victories, I went for Chaos Space Marines, Adeptus Custodes, Emperor's Children and Thousand Sons. First up, we've got the Thousand Sons, who perhaps had a surprisingly harsh nerf from Games Workshop. And for these guys, out of the armies here, they're the single one where I was debating putting them in tier 3. I could have happily put them down there. They did come from a position of pretty immense strength though, certainly by the numbers vying for being one of the single strongest factions in Warhammer 40k after the Knights and Death Guard nerfs. Recent win rates around 54% or so, and at least 9 big grand tournament victories. Pretty standout on all accounts. Games Workshop just came down on them harsher than I might have expected. For their core rules, they get their Kabbalistic rituals, pop-up psychic spells that can deal damage, debuff enemies against shooting, or move their units around, and typically tend to play with a heavy character focus, with the characters being the main focus of the unit and their squads as backup. The balanced data had a pretty broad nerf for them though. The vast majority of their competitive staples went up somewhere between a small to medium amount, the Zangor Enlightened with the Great Bows getting the single biggest points bump relatively. Hand in hand with that, they nerfed the Kabbalistic rituals. They can now only be attempted once, which is at least a fairly big deal. They did have a couple of small points decreases to go alongside it. 10 squad Scarab Terminators are cheaper, and their Terminator Sorcerers buff them better, and the Sekitar robots drop down to 80 points, which feels a lot more acceptable for a expendable infiltrator style unit. I genuinely expect the robots to see a bit more consistent play now. I still guess that the majority of people will play Grand Coven, which is the one that keys into their faction mechanics more, and perhaps the reroll stratagem for the psychic powers is more important than ever, given that you don't get a second chance on them. The others have generally had less good performance, Rubrique Phalanx being the other popular one. I guess the Scarab Cults getting cheaper isn't the worst thing in the world for them. Overall, I feel like with so many of their units going up and not having so many things to fall back on, the good stuff now will still be pretty similar to the good stuff before. Mutalists still seem usable and scary, Rubric Marines with Sorcerers, Infernal Masters, and perhaps a few more of the other Sorcerer variants now are still scary damage dealers, particularly out of Rhinos. They've got plenty of options for cheap skirmishing units. Magnus is pricier, though had a smaller relative points increase versus most of the rest, and I wonder if we might see a few more Predator Annihilators for some fairly serious anti-tank. They were already pretty punchy and they didn't go up. Kind of remains to be seen exactly how strong they're going to settle though. I would expect them to be on the sort of lower mid to lower power end of Warhammer 40k after them, given how many nerfs they got. It does feel like an overcorrection from Games Workshop to me, though at the same time they did come from a position where they were really quite strong. Next up, we've got the Chaos Space Marines. Pre-updates, their tournament wins were around 48%, and they had 6 grand tournament victories. I feel like both of those are pretty solid middle-of-the-road stats. The Heretic Astartes getting their Dark Packs for boosted damage with a chance to pay a price, and they tend to have an army of elites that usually play aggressively to hit the enemy hard with those before getting hit back. The last balance changes maybe had some small buffs overall. Cheaper Abaddon the Despoiler and Venom Crawlers, pricier Dark Communes don't help Chaos Cult or people wanting to use Accursed Cultists, and Fabius Bile's Revival change was a nice buff to him, possibly meaning that he gets one more turn of being able to act as he revives at the end of a phase. Pre-update, the fast-moving Renegade Raiders with their extra AP and advance and charge shenanigans were the ones that were being played the most, Pat-bound Zealots being the next most popular and successful, Creations of Bile having fallen off a fair bit. One of the bigger winners from the last balance update was the Lord Discordant, who went from being rather overcosted to really quite a solid and scary damage unit, moving very fast and then hitting quite hard between range and melee. Otherwise, Chosen or Legionaries with Lords and Rhinos often are a staple, perhaps Fabius Bile with Chosen or Abaddon with Chosen. Some cultists are usually a must for some sticky objectives. They usually have good fire support with sustained hits Predators or Vindicators. Cypher often makes an appearance as a high value lone operative. And then for skirmish and scoring units, they've got plenty of options. Bikers, Raptors, Warp Talons and Possessed are all nice. Overall, they felt like they were in a pretty fine place, and don't look like they're going to be changing all that much, but might have a bit more competition with certain armies getting some serious buffs in the update. Whereas I don't really feel like their changes changed anything too significantly. I guess Soulforge Warpack will be a bit better with the Venom Crawler changes, but that didn't tend to be one that lots of people were having success with competitively at least, maybe seen a bit more in casual play. For single biggest criticisms, I think it would still be very nice to see Games Workshop to have a go at fixing the Legion detachments that don't get play. The ones themes to the Alpha Legion, Night Lords and Iron Warriors have all been pretty underwhelming since the Codex release. I feel like they could be pretty perfect ones for a revamp. Next up, for the Scions of the Dark Prince, we've got the Emperor's Children. Pre-updates, their tournament win rates have been at 47%, so a bit on the lower side compared with the average. And again, hadn't been winning quite so many tournaments as well, just the 3 tournament victories, even if one of them was quite a big one. Their core mechanics have advanced shoot and charge and fallback shoot and charge, though some limitations with their thrill seekers. And generally with their Slanesh focus they move fast and tend to hit with a whole flurry of attacks. In the balance update they did get a couple of helpful buffs, maybe more for internal balance than anything else. Fulgrim got cheaper and has a movement rule that might help out on some tables, though not all. Flawless Blades feel like the bigger winner though, going +1 attack so they have 4 attacks rather than 3. That's a very meaningful damage increase, and I feel like they're actually going to be in contention for being a stronger damage dealer of the army now. They did get a slight surprise nerf to the Lord Cacophonist though, going up 10 points for some reason. For their detachments, the vast majority of people play with the Coterie of the Conceited, easy damage buffs and a few helpful melee stratagems. A few use Peerless Bladesmen, and certainly feels like that's gained ground with the Flawless Blades getting better. In general, their staples have been Infractors with a Lord Exultant, usually a couple of units of Tormentors to do objective things, Noise Marines often jumping out of Rhinos, Winged Demon Princes for big mortal wound impacts, maybe Morphines, and Lucius the Eternal and the Lord Cacophonist doing pretty well. I'd guess that we'll start to see more Flawless Blades in army lists, though I'm not 100% sure if they'll be auto-include or more of a maybe choice. I still also guess with the points decrease, Fulgrim's going to be more playable, but still probably not quite there in terms of being a competitive staple. You can still just get quite a lot of other stuff for that 340 point price tag. Overall still feels like they're in a pretty solid mid-tier position though. Some helpful internal balance changes. Maybe I should have put them towards the middle of middle. I'm sure they'll still be winning a good number of grand tournaments as a bit of a high skill player faction that's likely to have better success with the game experts than for the average player, given fragile fast moving units and needing to make good use of terrain and alpha strikes. Finally, for the low end of tier 2 I've ranked the Adeptus Custodes. Pre-updates their tournament stats were around 47% wins, and again maybe a little bit on the low side for tournament victories overall, just the 4. As ever, Adeptus Custodes generally tend to do better in more casual or RTT style play versus the top end of grand tournaments, though can clearly still win there. The Custodes certainly have their iconic playstyle, enormous indomitable defensive stat lines with high toughness, high invulnerable saves and 2+ saves, hitting on a 2+ with general purpose Guardian Spear stat lines, buffed with the Martial Qatar in close combat. The last balance update for them had some small buffs for them. They got cheaper Custodian Guard, dropping down to 160 points for a squad of 4 of them. The Land Raiders dropped a little as well. The Shield Captain went down to 120 for the standard one. A slightly lesser played bigger squads of Sisters of Silence went down as well, dropping by 15 points for the Vigilators or the Prosecutors. It doesn't really seem like it's going to change their playstyle in a major way. Most armies going for the Lions of the Emperor, with their big damage buffs for squads fighting in isolation. Some nice enhancements for Shield Captains and good stratagems for squads scrapping in the midboard. After several balance passes across 10th, the vast majority of their unique stuff is pretty solidly playable. Wardens and Blade Champions will still be a staple, Custodian Guard with Kyria Draxus, though I do wonder if with the points decreases a few more people might be tempted to take regular Custodian Guard over Wardens. Perhaps not for the whole army, but maybe subbing out another unit or something. They still won't be quite as tough, though will hit pretty hard. The fast movers with the Virtus Praetors and Venatari are both good. Alorus Custodians are nice, particularly in the lines of the Emperor. Usually some small squads of Sisters of Silence, Witch Seekers or Prosecutors are used to score objectives, and most of the Shield Captain flavors and Trajan Valoris do better in lines of the Emperor. Trajan enjoys being able to use his once per game ability a second time. Then often hovering in the backfield there might be a Caladius Grav tank or two with some heavy hitting long range anti-tank. For their downsides, with their standard playstyle they do tend to be a bit predictable as a stat check style army, maybe a bit at the mercy of how many 4+ invulnerable saves they can make, but it certainly doesn't make them necessarily easy to overcome. It feels like with the last balance update, the cheaper Custodian Guard was a genuinely helpful enough buff for them. I still guess they're probably going to be sort of mid-tier to maybe slightly lower mid, and more success in RTTs and casual tables as opposed to the tops of grand tournaments. Next up, and continuing with the bulk of tier 2 armies, here I've ranked the Space Wolves, Drukhari, Deathwatch, the Adeptus Mechanicus, Leagues of Votann, Orks, Astra Militarum, and Tau, Necrons, and Chaos Knights. It does feel like there's going to be really quite a lot of solid mid-tier factions that can absolutely do well at the highest level. Starting out with the Astra Militarum, pre-update they had win rates of around 47% or so. They're doing solidly well at the actual tops of events. 9 grand tournament wins is pretty strong going. I do seem to be doing a bit better for the faction experts as opposed to the more casual players playing different styles of lists, as often seems to be the case with win rates versus tournament victories. For their core mechanics, they're a predominantly ranged army, getting some nice boost with extra movement, firepower or toughness with orders. And in the last balance update they had some small nudges. Dawns and Dawn tank commanders went up 10 points, Gaunt's Ghost, Lord Solar, the Krieg Engineers and Super Heavies dropping down a bit. The vast majority of people have been playing the Hammer of the Emperor or the Combined Arms Regiment, maybe with a bit more success for the Combined Arms, with its lethal hits, Fields of Fire and Orders recently. They both seem to have been doing okay. A few people have been trying Mechanized or Recon. It looks like a couple of people have managed to win tournaments with big board control, cavalry and infantry recon regiments. For standout units, after the points drop, Gaunt's Ghosts seem at least fairly auto-include. 100 points for a return to reserves lone operative unit with all the extra things they can do is rather great. I still think Rogue Dawns and their commanders are going to be very strong tanks. Going up 10 points wasn't really enough to affect them. Plenty of the Rust variants are strong, and you can use some Hellhounds to strip cover. Kazakin in transports are still a good damage unit, Scout Sentinels can mark the way for other shooting, and Guard have got plenty of good stuff for objective skirmishing, Cadians with their sticky objectives and command squads to broadcast orders a long way, Kaschan Jungle Fighters to scout into the midboard, and perhaps Kriegsmen for a slightly more durable regenerating infantry squad. Lord Solar dropped a lot as well, maybe with a good buff to him a few more people might be tempted by him, perhaps in Hammer of the Emperor lists, where his extra tank orders are really quite useful. Overall doesn't feel like the biggest changes for them though. Maybe not great for the Hammer of the Emperor for any list that was spamming Dawns in a big way. It certainly still feels like there's plenty of things that you could do from an internal faction balance perspective. Lots of the utility artillery and some of the Krieg units are pretty bad, but overall they're certainly not feeling like they're in the worst place in the world. Next up, and maybe in a similar sort of slightly lowish average win rates but highish event win rates, are the Tau Empire. Pre-updates, players were winning around 46% of games with them, though they have been taking more than their fair share of tournament trophies, with the big 9 GT wins. Last time around they had their For the Greater Good change, which was a pretty good change, allowing one unit to spot for others, though it did come with some nerfs to things like Cao Yon and stealth suits going up in cost. This balance passed, Farsight and certain Crisis suits got cheaper, as did broadsides, particularly notably for the one model unit, and the Riptide Ion Accelerator going up to strength 10 makes an already strong unit just so much more general purpose against some transports and lighter battle tanks. The Tau have generally had some quite good balance between their detachments, most of them at least playable. Seems that Cao Yon still being one of the best performing for tournament victories currently, despite Montcar being the most played. The Kroot Hunting Pack also seems to have been doing very well for a small group of people making it work. It does some pretty great board control, and Kroot Rampages are a very efficient datasheet when the Kroot Hunting Pack buffs are thrown in. Most of the Codex units are fairly solidly usable depending on detachment though. Stealth suits to mark things, Devilfish Breachers moving into the midboard for Montcar Cao Yon and Experimental Prototype. Lots of nice anti-tank fire support, where I feel like broadsides have certainly caught up on the tanks and Riptides a bit. I'm sure we'll see more Riptides too though. For internal balance and helping out Retaliation Cadre, the Crisis Suit combos and Farsight going down, that's going to be fairly impactful to gain a touch there. And then they have some good utility units as well, Kroot Carnivores with their sticky objectives, Bespid returning to reserves and Pathfinders infiltrating. If they're doing well at grand tournaments before, certainly still seems like they're going to be now. Nice to see some useful buffs to ones that we're already seeing play. I guess their win rate might move a little bit closer towards the mid-tier of armies, compared with being a bit low on the low end before. Next up we've got the Space Wolves, having a fairly recent codex alongside their fun new model range. They've done well on the win rate so far at around about 51% wins, though perhaps slightly weirdly only having taken down one grand tournament with that. I'd guess there's an element of bad luck at play there. They've had quite a good number of high placings and podium finishes. They get the Space Marine Oath of Moment plus their Sagas mechanic for an objective to achieve per detachment, and in the recent balance update they got nerfs rather than buffs. Two of the best characters with Ayak Rockfist and Ragnar Blackmane going up, Thunderwolf Cavalry getting the biggest increase, which certainly seems like a direct blow to the faction strength, given that they were certainly in the running for one of the very strongest datasheets. Big Bloodclaw units went up, although fewer people were using those, and they also had the Space Marine changes, a few buffs but also nerfs to things like Blade Guard and Ballistas Dreads. For detachment options, the Saga of the Beastslayer is easily the most played one. A strong damage dealer detachment rule, plus a bunch of helpful stratagems. Gladius Task Force has also been doing rather well indeed for them as well, and Stormlance has been okay, though might be a little bit less relevant if Thunderwolf Cavalry got worse. For their standout staple units, most lists make some good use of Terminators. Logan Grimnar I'm sure will still be an absolute staple, and Ayak still seems usable. I still think that Ragnar Blackmane is going to be overall very good, likely backed up by 10 Bloodclaws, though maybe Head Takers work too. In Saga of the Beastslayer, the Hammer Wolfen are rather stand out with a Wolf Touch battle leader, and Bjorn the Fellhand is quite nice for rustling up some command points, as well as just being a fighty dreadnought, all of that backed up by some standard Space Marine support. Overall I do feel like the points nerfs will be a direct impact to faction strength though, maybe eventually dropping their win rates by a few pips perhaps, though I still think they've got plenty of good stuff to fall back on. It was maybe a shame that a few of the underpowered datasheets didn't see a bit of help with this one. Would have been nice to see some improvements for Grey Hunters or maybe Njal Stormcaller. Next up I've also chosen to rank the Orks mid-tier. I'll certainly be interested to see where they wind up. Coming from a place where they were perhaps one of the very weakest factions in Warhammer 40k, win rates are around 43% and not too many grand tournament wins either. but then got some pretty enormous buffs in the balance update. They had some reversals of previous nerfs to big squads of looters and flash kits and the shock attack gun mech, all very good for tactical brigade and dread mob traps. The Squigosaur bosses went down by a lot, the bikes dropped a bit, Snickrot went down to 75 points, and Mega Knobs and the Mega Boss also lost points as well. Commandos were one of the other seriously big winners. Being able to split into 2 squads basically gives you twice the utility of the unit that you had before. That's a pretty major buff, and Commandos weren't unusable before anyway. Between them and Snickrot giving you lots of cheap utility units that can infiltrate, that seems like a major win for Ork board control and the objective game. Ghazghkull got better, taking up less room in a battle wagon, and being able to join boys or knob squads is another serious improvement. He'll be a lot more flexible now, and there were some other improvements to kill rigs, killer cans and death dreads too. Overall seems like it should be a solid boost for Orks across the board. Previously they'd mainly been playing and doing well with Warhorde, though only to some extent, given the faction's issues previously. Tactical Brigade have been doing okay, and most of the others saw play at least. Several of the datasheet changes do feel like they'll help Tactical Brigade or others. I still probably guess that most people will go for Warhorde as the primary way to play. Various combos of scary melee stuff with boys, knobs, breaker boys, and Ghazghkull Thraka himself maybe jumping out of transports. I'd guess that as well as Gretchen and maybe Storm Boys, Commandos and Snickrot, we'll see lots of play in just about every detachment. Flash kits and tank busters are good, and with the big shooty squad drops that certainly helps out the ranged detachments like Dread Mob and Tactical. At first impressions, I guess that the changes are going to be enough to put them right back in contention. A far more balanced army against the rest of the game, though I'd say probably not stand out, given that they came from a place where they seem to be quite behind the curve. Certainly feels that more melee violence, now with more added Storm Boys and Snickrot, seems like a direct upgrade, and maybe some of the slightly lesser played units that got other points cuts will break through too. Next up, and again for a faction maybe in a similar sort of vein, we've got the Deathwatch. They seem to have been underperforming over the past 3 months or so, win rates of 45%, though managing to take down 2 event wins definitely isn't bad for them, and compared with other factions that's actually quite a high relative number given how few people play them. They get their Oath of Moment, and the vast majority of Deathwatch players use the Black Spear Task Force, getting them their mission tactics and their special issue ammo and teleportation. Deathwatch were very directly one of the bigger winners out of the last balance pass. The Watchmaster and the Deathwatch veterans dropped down in cost, and then all the other Primaris kill teams dropped basically across the board. The Space Marines did have some changes as well, though Deathwatch might care about those a bit less, as they do generally tend to build around their kill teams. For standout units, the Indomitor kill team was already one of the stars of the index, and now seems more so. It got a big 20 points cut, so it went down as much as anything. I guess perhaps Deathwatch veterans and the Terminators lost out a little in comparison to the others, at least in terms of relative points decreases. The Deathwatch veterans are still waiting for their new kill team Tomb World datasheet, which could change things quite a bit for them, so I've got some unknowns there still. I still expect the core of the army to be those good kill teams buffed by characters such as Gravis Captains, Watchmasters and Judaseers, and then some support on the objective scoring front with the Space Marine utility units like Infiltrators, Intercessors, the Combi Lieutenant, maybe a Storm Speeder Thunderstrike to mark some targets potentially. Overall they did come from a place where they weren't doing quite so well, but with some staple things getting some good points decreases, feels like they might be right back in the mix. They're still in an odd place within 40k in general though, surviving through their sort of balance patch rather than a full codex. Next up we've got the Dark Eldar. The Drukhari have been seeming fairly mid-tier over the past few months, win rates of around 50%, again not hugely stand out with the tournament victories, though that's still not awful given a small player base. They've got a new codex coming fairly soon, though for the moment they still have their rerolls and movement buffs from pain tokens, typically moving fast with low defensive profiles and making good use of their open top transports. In the balance pass they didn't really get any significant changes, just pairs of the Kronos Parasite engines getting weirdly cheap, down at 85 points. They've oddly become one of the very most durable units in Warhammer 40k. I'd guess that some people will be tempted just to include the other one for sheer annoyance factor, as the opponent's likely to have to waste far more damage on them than they're really worth. For detachments, most have been having success with the Reaper's Wager, which got the reroll ones to hit last time. That's nice for supporting units to move fast into melee and hit hard when they get there. Some still doing well with the Sky Splinter as well. At present it feels like almost everything in the index is good enough to be relevant. Maybe Cabalites and Venoms, Mandrakes for Infiltrate and Fading Away, and the Beastmaster for Scout Board Control are fairly standout. Then for damage dealers, Scourges with Haywire or big hitting Lancers, the Archon with some Incubi or a Court Cabalite unit, Lilith with Witches, and maybe the odd Ravager or Void Raven can all hit pretty hard. Talos are usable enough, though maybe a bit better in Real Space Raiders, and Kronos are going to remain auto-include at least for one, even if you don't take more. The biggest thing in flux for them at the moment is their codex coming out, which will bring other changes. Some stuff seems good, some stuff maybe less so. They are going to lose some options, though it feels a bit meaningless to talk about the strength of that at the moment while we don't have digital points costs for it, which could be quite different to the printed ones. It feels like it's had some mixed reception, though certainly feels a bit more interesting than certain 10th edition codexes that have come out, even if there's some good and bad. Until that point though, it still seems like they'll probably continue doing fine. Fairly middle tier, and neither stand out too strong or too weak. For Leagues of Votann, it's fairly early days since their codex came out. It seems like for the tournament weekends where they have been active, their win rates have been around about 50% or so. I don't think they've got any Grand Tournament wins yet, but do seem to have had a couple of undefeated runs already, which is basically as good as. The new Votann codex adds in a whole bunch of different units into their roster, plus their yield points as the core mechanic. They do get a helpful army buffing rule whether you've got many or few of them though. Their codex having just come out, there weren't really any balance changes. They just had the wording of a Bramfast Oathbound stratagem altered to prevent doing some weirdly easy charges with it. Technically a nerf I suppose, but did seem like it might have been unintentional. For detachments, it seems like the Brandfast Oathband and the Needguard Oathband have been the ones that have been most popular and doing fairly well so far. Some fairly general purpose damage and defensive ones, if a little more limited than the Index, or a transport focused detachment that's good for the land fortresses, certain transported squads and infantry shooting. Just about every unit in the codex looks like it's pretty usable, which I think is nice. I do feel like there's a bunch of ones that are just on the next level though. Brockir Thunderkin are just absolutely awesome damage dealers, and the Hexon Land Fortress is mighty on damage and defense. Hernkin Jaegirs and Capricus Carriers to split them in half are just exactly what you want on the utility unit front, and you can still get some sticky objectives from Hearthkin Warriors. For character support, Uthal the Destin with his discounted stratagems and a Memnir strategist to camp the home field and manipulate yield points is well worth it. Both flavours of the Ironkin Steeljacks are solid, perhaps being a bit of a second choice to Brockirs and Land Fortresses for the first amount of damage, but just quite nice to have a unit that can take a punch as well as give one out. Though as mentioned, pretty much literally everything else is usable to a greater or lesser extent. It feels like as before, the Leagues of Votann still play relatively straightforward damage and defense Warhammer 40k, with some units having some slightly slower movement and shorter threat ranges than some, but do make up for it with a lot of raw might and damage dealing when they need to bring it. At least early impressions looks like they're still going to be remaining where they were before the codex update, more options to play and most stuff usable, and likely remaining as a solid mid-tier army, neither overpowered nor underpowered. Next up we've got the Chaos Knights. They had their points increases early, perhaps being one of the biggest, scariest and most oppressive factions in 40k for a bit, alongside their Imperial brothers and the Death Guard. There hasn't been too much time for new stats and impressions since that happened, though it looks like their win rates have been around about the 49-50% kind of mark, and winning a grand tournament certainly wasn't initially looking like they'd been nuked into oblivion or anything. As usual, they'll be functioning as an army of big stompy walkers, titanic ones smashing through walls supported by some war dogs, and then their auras of dread abilities that can build up throughout the battle. It seems that unlike the Death Guard, the Chaos Knights got a few more nerfs in the balance pass. The Lord of Dread core detachment stratagem was nerfed to just being in the command phase, which does limit the options and shenanigans that you could do with that. It still remains a powerful detachment rule though. The Abhorrent Mortal Wound ability doesn't stack, so not really such a great idea to have two of those running side by side as it might have been. And the Infernal Lance got a nerf as well, with their durability option being less strong, either getting the invulnerable save or the feel no pain, not both. Despite those changes, I'd still strongly expect that the Infernal Lance and Lords of Dread will be the ones to go for. It looks like more people have been playing Infernal Lance since the points changes, and particularly seem to have been doubling down on the double Gatling Despoiler. Despite points increases, those things with lethal hits are still rather murderous. It is quite a nice generalist one as well, with some things for War Dogs too, and access to Diabolic Bulwark is quite a big one. Otherwise, for standout units, the War Dog Carnivore is still great for a melee skirmisher, the Stalker's nice with Scouts, plenty of other viable big Titanic Knights, maybe the Abominant, Rampager, Lancer, Tyrant and Atropos being the standout ones after the changes. And then it's usually worth having some allied demons with Nurglings and Beasts to do some board control and objective style things at lower cost, given that they've had further nerfs despite already having dropped down to a much more balanced mid-tier faction. Having further nerfs to some of their best stuff isn't exactly going to be great news for them. I'd guess they might be a little bit towards the lower end of this section. I could have been tempted to put them in the lower end of tier 2 ones. I still expect that Infernal Lance dual Gatling Despoilers are going to be pretty horrendous to fight against though, and might just have a tiny bit more chance to surprise if the entire meta isn't teching to take down Knights. Now we've got a couple of armies that I'd say maybe towards the upper end of this section, as debating on putting them towards the top of tier 2. For the Necrons, they've been just doing fairly solidly well and pretty well balanced since the last updates, win rates of 49% and 5 Grand Tournament victories, neither particularly bad nor particularly stand out within 40k as a whole. The last balance changes don't feel like they're going to affect that in an enormous way. The Silent King dropped down a meaningful 20 points, but also got a Norse modifier rule swapped out for movement buffs. I'll certainly not say it's got weaker out of that due to the 20 points drop, though his role is a bit different. The Triarch Praetorians dropping down to 90 points per 5 makes them a bit more tempting, though still not probably standout. Overall, as a result, I'd expect them to be fairly similar to where they were before. Starshatter Arsenal with its fast-moving gun vehicles and Awakened Dynasty with its character combos still being the core detachments to go for, and a whole load of units pretty viable. The race with Technomancer being a standout durable frontline bully unit, lots of good utility units like Flayed Ones, Hexmarks, Deathmarks and others. The Silent King and Doomsday Arcs being good wherever, maybe more so in Starshatter. Scorpet Destroyers with a Lord being nice and Awakened, and plenty of other strong options such as Imitate the Stormlord for command points, Canoptek Reanimators to double down on units bouncing back, and the Nightbringer can certainly add some scary might to an army, even if he's very slow. Overall feels like they're still in a broadly good spot. I feel like it might be nice to see a bit more focus on their Warriors and Immortals. They don't really seem to get good without having some pretty maximal character buffs built around them, and they do have a few things that only really get interesting in the right detachment, like say Canoptek Doomstalkers not being so great outside of their Canoptek Court detachment. Finally, and also I'd guess pushing on the upper end of this section are the Adeptus Mechanicus. They've been a bit on the mid to underwhelming side for 40k for a while. Win rates of 46% and 3 tournament victories last time around. Not overly strong but not super underpowered either. They've had a massive amount of changes since their underpowered codex came out. Doctrina Imperatives being buffed in a big way, half the datasheets being rewritten, though a few units going up in points to represent those abilities. The latest balance change felt like it added yet another layered buff to the army in general. Now Core has his essentially Admech Oath of Moments to mark a target for all hit rerolls against it, and can swap out for another couple of ones if it happens to be better in any one turn. That in itself though does feel like it's going to be an overall boost to the faction, even if it costs them 40 points. It feels like their fire support is just going to be kind of next level as well. That might lessen the relevance of the Cataphoron Breachers if everything's able to reroll hit rolls against the right targets. Otherwise, Iron Striders gains Twin Linked for 5 points. That easily seems like an overall win for them. Infiltrators and Ruststalkers got changes. Infiltrators getting a direct buff when they basically auto-include was a big win. And the Eradication Beamer Onager might be more of a rival for the Neutron Laser now. It still feels overall like they'll be using either Halo Screed or Skitarii Hunter cohorts. Halo Screed with the big focal units, good support for Breachers, and some nice advance and charge things for Ruststalkers. Hunter cohort being nice for skirmish things with the Skitarii. A first impressions call does seem pretty auto-include, unless you really wanted to build around things like Breachers that might already reroll the hits. Infiltrators were auto-include and got more so. Generally you'd want some Skitarii troops for the battle line buffs, Taraxi to score some points. The Scorpius shooting is still some of the best anti-tank, though it seems like both the Iron Striders and the Onager have gained ground there. And Ruststalkers are a nice general purpose damage unit. Overall feels like they've had a very solid direct boost. It feels like the core upgrade is likely enough to make the faction directly better by itself, never mind anything else that changed. As a result, I'd certainly expect them to be a lot more in contention than they used to be. Maybe we'll see a few more tournament victories from the Admech. Finally, for the factions that went on the higher end of tier 2 for, here I've ranked the World Eaters, Imperial Knights, Genestealer Cults and Chaos Demons. Again, maybe nosing ahead a bit, but not considerably given all the other good armies here. First up, we've got the Genestealer Cults, who certainly got some nerfs in the balance update, but they did come from a position where they were doing immensely well. As a faction, tournament win rate around 55%, with the Host of Ascension, at least on paper, being the single strongest faction in Warhammer 40k, with a big 61% wins and taking down a huge number of grand tournaments. Getting 11 grand tournament victories was huge at the top tournament success rates, and particularly so for a lesser played faction. It meant that Genestealer Cults were the single army that you're most likely to turn up to an event and win a grand tournament with. They have their classic insurgency guerrilla warfare playstyle, much of the army deep striking, cult ambush to resurrect a few key units for a second wave, and plenty of the detachments having some sneaky tricks to help you get alpha strikes and then fade away. Games Workshop did quite directly hit their power build. The Primus did get cheaper, but his +1 to hit rule is a lot less strong compared with the reroll hits that he had before. It doesn't stack as well with a whole number of buffs over the codex and doesn't help Overwatch. Small squads of Jackals and the Achilles Ridge Runner increased, both of which were very good units, and the Ridge Runner still seems fairly auto-include. But now you're going to be paying quite a premium for that extra AP exactly where you want it if you take the Lone Mortar one. And the Host of Ascension was directly nerfed with the Stratagem for critical hits on a 5+ going up to 2. And he can't just fade units into reserve when they're shot as well, which means the opponent can know they can safely shoot nearfight blocks and then go on to charge them without having them slipping away in the meantime. It's still a very good stratagem though, and it does open up possibilities for where you'd be able to return to reserves when you wouldn't otherwise have been able to. Otherwise, they did get quite a few buffs as well. Metamorphs dropped down despite being a good unit already. I certainly expect to see more of those. The Abominant and bigger units of Pure Strain Genestealers got cheaper as well, which seems like a buff to Biosantic Brood Surge. Small squads of Aberrants cost fewer Resurgence points, and a few other Cult Ambush token related stratagems were altered to try and make them a bit more relevant with the way that they changed the rules. Overall, for an army that was doing rather well by the numbers pre-update, this certainly doesn't seem like it's the worst news for them. Host of Ascension certainly looks like it'll be weaker between the Primus and the stratagem changes, but still brings a lot of good stuff, including the core rule that wasn't touched at all. It still seems like it's going to be overall strong, and those Neophyte blocks didn't get any more expensive. Final Day, Biosantic Brood Surge and Outlander Claw probably gained ground on it though. In particular Biosantic Brood Surge given the Abominant and the Pure Strain changes as well, though it did seem to be performing less well than the rest previously. Achilles Ridge Runners still seem great, and the version with heavy mining lasers didn't drop at all. They've got loads of great utility unit options between Pure Strains, Acolytes of the different types, and small Neophyte squads with sticky objectives. Metamorphs seem pretty strong wherever. Big Neophyte blocks are still looking pretty nasty in both Host of Ascension and Final Day, and most lists make room for some lone operatives as well, particularly the Reductus Saboteur. Overall, between all that, I'd still guess they're probably going to be on the slightly upper mid sort of end of Warhammer 40k power level. Despite being a slightly harder faction to play and some big decisions that you can potentially get right or wrong, the best attachment being nerfed solidly will certainly impact them, though I still guess the Host of Ascension will be a very viable way to play them. Next up, we've got the Imperial Knights, which is maybe a bit on the fence between putting them here versus the sort of middle of tier 2. They've had their new codex essentially go live now with the points cost for it. They were the same points as we saw the updated ones for recently. It looks like over the past couple of weeks with Noble Lance they've still been doing well. Win rates are around 51% and a couple of Grand Tournament wins. Like the Chaos Knights, they're a whole army of big stompy walkers, big knights smashing through walls. Command point rewards I guess usually for killing units now with their altered code chivalric. And despite the hype around super speedy knights, I still guess that the majority of people will wind up going for the big hitting damage rerolls that code chivalric can bring. The last balance changes were more the impact of how the new codex will alter things for the knights, and in particular it feels maybe more like a nerf than a buff overall, though maybe not a huge one. And Games Workshop also made some changes to Day 0 patch the knights, putting their OC back up to 10 for the big ones, which was listed lower for some reason, and hit the Valstrike Lance with some rather big nerfs, no longer re-rolling advanced rolls, and the 3 stratagems that could affect multiple knights now just being locked to 1. Given the options they actually lost from the Noble Lance as well, I'd probably rate Valstrike as slightly weaker than the Noble Lance, if directly comparing one to the other. I'm certainly going to be interested to see what sees play for the Knights. Valstrike is still general purpose, though maybe Questoris Companions could get a bit of a look in with its advance and charge and helpful support for the Titanics. Spearheaded Arms is more limited, though you can make some super shooty Helverin combos there. Gate Wardens has some interesting buffs, though I'm just a bit apprehensive as to how good they're really going to be if they're so locked to that defensive line. For standout units, it still feels like Canis Rex is going to be strong with the discounted stratagems. He didn't really lose crazy amounts going from Index to Codex, though isn't quite as damage dealing as he used to be. Otherwise, perhaps the Lancers, Atropos, Defender, Crusader and Castellan all looking pretty strong, and the mixed role Knights also seem fine. Both the Armiger Warglaves and the Helverins will be relevant as some cheaper units that can do grunt work and still have threat of their own. And I still expect most lists will take some agents along for some cheaper units, particularly the Calatus Assassin, maybe some Sisters and Immolators. Overall, probably for the best that Games Workshop did make some early patches to the Knights, in case the big nightly rush was quite as bad as people were hyping it up to be. Still feels like they're going to have an enormous amount of raw might and big hitting damage profiles, likely going to be more dominant in casual and RTT style games versus the top end of competitive, as they normally are. It does feel like lacking their Feel No Pain and not having rotate ion shields in every detachment will make them easier to take down post-codex though. Between all that I'd guess that they're going to be more mid-tier as opposed to top-tier. Next up, we've got the World Eaters, doing at least fairly well prior to the balance pass with 49% wins, and then really quite a lot of Grand Tournament success with 12 tournament victories. And of course, as the Chaos Space Marines dedicated to Khorne, they're the melee rush faction, getting the blessings of Khorne to help them get there and hit harder when they do. And the vast majority of their core units have a melee focus. For armies in the balance pass, they felt like they had one of the biggest side grades out of everything. Staples such as the Forge Fiend, Spawn and Khan the Betrayer all went up in cost, whereas the 8-bound and Exalted 8-bound got a pretty enormous points decrease, the Slaughterbound getting a buff as well, going up to Strength 10, the Exalted 8-bound getting their huge damage 3 increase against monsters and vehicles, and Angron and the Terminators going down a bit too. For detachment choice, most play the Berserker Warband, plus 2 strength and plus 1 attack on the charge is awesome for any melee army, and it does have some good supporting rules beyond that. It feels like after the update, World Eaters lists are probably going to be looking fairly different. I just expect a much greater emphasis on both types of 8-bound now. The scouting regular ones got so much better and they were already pretty solid before. The exalted ones were maybe a bit more niche, but now they bring some pretty ridiculous and hard-hitting anti-tank damage. Could be a scary option to deliver via rapid ingress. The other staples still generally seem playable though. Berserkers in a Rhino with Khan still seems alright, going up only 15 points on a 340 point unit essentially. For the whole combo, really isn't actually that big of a points nerf. Spawn are less efficient, though they were absolutely great before. Jackals are nice to have for sticky objectives and skirmishing. The Foot Demon Prince is still a strong one in Berserker Warband, and Hellbrutes still remain murderous and violent. If they are able to get into melee, then the damage output can be huge with their fighting again. I say Forge Fiends are still usable, but that points increase was quite a big one, and I think really will take the efficiency off them, particularly with the 8-bound damage dealers being buffed so much. At first impression, still seems like Angron hasn't really got enough help to really make him meaningfully better, particularly given that the 8-bound dropped down so much more proportionally, and having their best shooting platform getting notably worse will make them less well-rounded and have less options for solving their problems and just having to resort to melee violence, as you might expect from the lore. It does feel maybe a bit hard to predict where they're going to wind up, given an enormous boost to a central melee unit, but also solid nerfs to several staples. I guess they're probably going to be about the same or a bit stronger than they were before. I'm not sure if I should have been a bit braver and ranked them up in top tier. Finally, for the armies that I've ranked here, we've got the denizens of the Dark Gods themselves, the Chaos Demons. They've been in a pretty solid upper mid sort of level over the last 3 months or so. Win rates of roughly 50% and 9 tournament victories, so also doing well on the top tables. They play very differently to the vast majority of armies out there, deep strike across the board, mostly having invulnerable saves as opposed to armor saves, and the Shadow of Chaos having some morale debuffs. Each deity also has their own ways to fight, which affect their stat lines. The last balance changes were pretty minimal for them. The Keeper of Secrets got cheaper, though probably to the point where they're more rivaling the other greater demons than necessarily adding faction strength, and the Legion of Excess got a buff, though it was the least played deity detachment after the brief period where it was just rather dominant. For detachments at the moment, it's mainly the Demon Incursion and then the Shadow Legion that are being used most on the competitive scene. Demon Incursion having the most success maybe, the easy charges from reserves are a big advantage, and they have great enhancements for the greater demons. The Shadow Legion maybe having a little bit less success but still some tournament victories, and has good buffs for the different deities, plus scouting and fading away greater demons are also very nice. The deity ones aren't so bad either, the Plague Legion and the Scintillating Legion maybe being far lesser played in casual. They seem to be adequately doing board control things and getting some victories on the competitive scene. Most demons armies tend to revolve around a core of greater demons, Be'lakor often leading the way, and maybe the Great Unclean one of the single most standout datasheets, though basically all the rest are viable, some maybe a little stronger than others. And then the greater demon damage dealers are usually backed up by a good array of objective grabbers, infiltrating Nurglings, sticky objective plague bearers, beasts of Nurgle as cheap annoying scouts, flesh hounds to bounce on and off the board, and perhaps some flamers and screamers of Tzeentch as nuisance units. Corn things can be good stuff to charge out of reserve in the Demon Incursion perhaps, and it maybe feels like the Slanesh units are still paying for the sins of the pre-nerf Legion of Excess, often used in a bit more of a smaller investment supporting role. Overall feels like they were performing as a sort of upper mid-tier kind of faction before, and it still seems likely to be the case now. Maybe the single biggest issue for the army being the uncertainty around how Games Workshop's going to treat them going forward after not deciding they were important enough to give a codex to in 10th. Then finally we get to the armies that are ranked in the top tier here, a few factions that maybe just feel just a little more solidly above average. Though again, with how strong quite so many of their contenders are down in tier 2, these ones really don't feel all that far ahead. I feel like the two that I feel most comfortable, probably a bit higher than most, are Aeldari and Death Guard, whereas the ones that feel a bit more borderline here might be Blood Angels, Black Templars and Sisters. I'd certainly be happy to rate them solid upper mid armies, but not necessarily particularly far ahead of the ones just talked about. For those ones, first up we've got the Black Templars. They do seem to have been doing very well since their codex came out. Win rates for the faction as a whole 50% or so, though if you take their Gladius on its own, which seems to be the competitive detachment, that's been doing better, depending on the counts around about 54% or so win rates. Black Templar Gladius certainly looks like one of the more intimidating things to overcome out there in 40k. It seems they've had at least 4 tournament victories since their codex release, and that's really not all that long a time. They have been doing pretty well on the top tables. Their codex made the interesting decision to replace standard Oath of Moment with their Vows mechanic, usually equating to a +1 to wound against a whole bunch of stuff in melee. That certainly feels like one of the biggest sources of faction strength. Lots of slightly more mid-melee units just get a lot better with that on the go. For the balance changes, they did get a few Space Marine nerfs. The big Blade Guard squad going up in cost a little will affect them, though for any people using Land Raiders to get things into battle, they got a little cheaper. Their core codex was a bit too close to see any alterations though. It hadn't come out all that long ago, the same as the Grey Knights. For detachment choices, Games Workshop just didn't really make a great job of the detachments in their codex, and as a result people are playing the Gladius Task Force, as it just works out as a better general purpose melee detachment to support the fighting elite of the army. Access to advance and charge, a few helpful damage dealers and reactive moves and things are fairly good there. I'm really not sure why Games Workshop decided to take Righteous Crusaders away and not give the Black Templars a more generic detachment in its place where the choices aren't locked to keywords. For their powerhouse units though, Sword Brethren with the Castellan and Martial combo absolutely wreck most things that they charge into. Helbrecht is a pretty reasonable one to swap the Martial out for as well. The Emperor's Champion is just a strong datasheet however is fielded. Some like to go with Assault Intercessors to give him some rerolls. Templar Impulsors could deliver both of them there, although they could also charge out of the incredibly scary Black Templar Repulsor Executioners. They get enormously easy access to rerolls, which is a big deal, and then they can back all that up with some strong Space Marine utility units, with usual infiltrating sticky objectives, and some cheap fast movers like Jump Intercessors, which also work well in combat. Overall, they're still looking like they're in a place to remain solidly strong. Perhaps for the biggest criticisms and weaknesses, it would just be nice if they could do so in one of their own detachments, as opposed to being dependent on the generic Codex one. As some of the units in Codex don't feel particularly well balanced, Crusader squads do have their own damage combos, but the majority of people seem to be all about the Sword Brethren at the moment. I would guess they're probably going to get some negative balance changes next time around as well. I'd certainly expect their Repulsor Executioners to get hit. Next up, and another example of an army that seemed to have been doing rather well by the numbers and then got some small buffs in the balance data slate, are the Adepta Sororitas. They had win rates around the sort of 50 to 51% kind of mark, and had been another army that had been doing fairly standout for the event wins, 7 tournament victories from really quite a small player base, and along with the Genestealer Cult had been doing rather well in terms of tournament victories per the amount of people playing them, with more chance than most to go all the way to the top. Their core faction mechanic has their miracle dice, having the Emperor intervene directly in dice rolls for some big damage potentially, or feeding them into unit abilities, and they generally tend to play as a low defense but hard hitting, close range shooting and melee kind of army, usually needing to make some careful use of cover. With their balance changes, they got buffs to Retributors in quite a big way. They dropped down 10 points, and also their datasheet rule got far better. Now they get both the rerolls and the +1 to hit and wound against units that have destroyed other sisters' units, meaning that when they're out for vengeance, they do it in a very big way. Celestine also dropped a tiny bit, and Astrid and Agatha also went down. I'd say the Retributors is probably the most meaningful one for faction power though. It feels like they went from being a lesser played unit that was rather overshadowed to being right back in contention between the two buffs in tandem. For their strong detachments, it's generally been the Hallowed Martyrs and the Champions of Faith. Hallowed Martyrs really helping out with their characters. Morven Vahl likes that detachment in particular, and having some good manipulation for forcing the enemy to attack other things in melee. And Champions of Faith have some big boosts to some of their strongest units in the Paragon Warsuits and Celestian Sacrosants led by characters. Otherwise, beyond them, the Castigator's great for some volume fire plus debuffing with AP. The Immolator with some Battle Sisters is nice for sticky objectives, and the other half of the squad moving forward. Arco-Flagellants are a good skirmish melee unit. They've got plenty of other small squad utility, lone characters or Seraphim, Dominions, and Retributors jumping out of transports potentially. Novitiates can be a useful infiltrator squad. The Canoness is quite good alongside some Sacrosants, and Fighty Palatines are nice with through suffering strength, maybe alongside some Novitiate rerolls. Again, still feels like they're set to be strong. They were before and got better if anything, with fragile units reliant on alpha strikes, big damage, and careful use of their miracle dice resource though. They can be a bit of a higher skill faction to play compared with some in 40k. Next up, we've got the Blood Angels, feeling in a fairly similar spot balance-wise to the previous two. Again, solid win rates over the last 3 months, 51% wins at tournaments, and then doing rather well on the top tables as well, getting 10 tournament victories, though admittedly with far more people playing the faction versus the sisters. They've generally been doing that with hard-hitting melee in the Liberator Assault group with their +1 to their attacks and +2 to strength on the charge, plus some nice supporting stratagems such as advance and charge. And in the last update, Sanguinary Guard became a far more focal unit, dropping down to perhaps surprisingly low points costs, and becoming even more a staple for the army than they were before. In the recent balance patch though, Sanguinary Guard went up again. They were 110 points for a squad of 3 of them, now they went up to 125 or 260 for a squad of 6, but at the same time it was more of a side grade than a downgrade, as they upgraded their weapon skill to a 2+, and gave the Lances the same amount of attacks as the Blades, so you basically have the choice of either extra AP or the Lance keyword built in. Kind of an interesting choice that isn't necessarily one obvious winner, given that you can get Lance quite easily in several detachments. Feels like you could have some squads with Blades and some with Lances and not feel too bad now. They'll be more expensive and they won't have as much synergy with Dante, but even waiting for points their hitting power went up. so are now more devastating on the board for the points cost, though even easier to take down in return for the amount of points that you pay. They will also be affected by the Space Marine changes as well, which feel more of a nerf than a buff. Blade Guard and the Ballistas going up both feel relevant, as do the big squads of 10 jump pack intercessors, a bit more so for the Blood Angels compared with elsewhere, though they do have lots of other options to fall back on. Overall, it feels more of a side grade or a tiny downgrade to me. They're probably not going to be enough to affect faction strength in a meaningful way. They do have lots of other great options as well, the Sanguinor and Mephiston, captains and assault intercessors, maybe with the Rage Fuel Warrior. All the Space Marines incidental skirmish units have their melee dialed up to 11 by Liberator, and they've still got strong options for Space Marine firepower to back them up, such as Vindicators or Gladiator Lancers. The Angelic Inheritors is also a strong detachment as well. They might have things a little more awkward for the Sanguinary Guard, with Dante just not doing quite as much for them as he used to, as his +1 to hit has become redundant. Overall, between all that, still feels like they're probably going to be in an upper mid-tier sort of place in Warhammer 40k. I expect the Sanguinary Guard changes aren't going to be bad for them, though I guess might not necessarily enjoy the nerfs to Blade Guard or Ballistas Dreads maybe, but both still feel usable, and they've got plenty of other options they could use instead. Getting on to the last two armies that feel a bit more comfortably in the top tier. First up, we've got the ever-resilient Death Guard. They had some rather big points nerfs a few weeks back. They seem to have been doing absolutely fine since. Win rates are around 52% or so, and 3 grand tournament events in 2 weeks since the nerfs. Plenty more high placings, and it's still looking like they're a massive force to be reckoned with on the tabletop. For their army rules, they've got some chunky defensive stat lines, Contagions of Nurgle giving you some big debuffs nearby for enemy toughness and maybe AP. And if playing Virulent Vectorium, they get their infected objectives. Sticky objectives army-wide is quite helpful for the scoring game. Unlike the Chaos Knights, who are maybe in a similar sort of spot, the Death Guard didn't get any further nerfs in the balance updates, and as a result, perhaps particularly with some nerfs to some other competitor armies like the Thousand Sons, seem like they're probably going to be in a pretty good place. Virulent Vectorium maybe seems to have got further ahead since the balance updates. Not quite as many people playing Mortarian's Hammer, given that the Demon engines went up a bit more in a focused way compared with the rest, particularly Plague Burst Crawlers. Both it and the Champions of Contagion are still usable though. For the units that seem to be doing well for them, it's mainly the similar ones to before, Death Shroud and Lord of Contagion dropping in to do charges from 6 inches away, maybe delivered by Poxwalkers, getting the Contagions of Nurgle right up to the enemy's front door straight away. Plague Marine combos cost a lot when they're jumping out of Rhinos that can demolish most things in the game when they get a full round of shooting and melee into them. The bloat drones with the heavy blight launchers went from being flatly undercosted to still very good, quite nice to direct their heavy blight launcher firepower with the Lord of Virulence. Blight Haulers and the other plague drones are rather nice as well. The Demon Prince of Nurgle with the 5+ feel no pain in Virulent Vectorium is still rather standout. Typhus is nice. The Lone Tallyman can still rustle up command points, and Mortarion himself maybe gained a bit on the rest, not going up in points when everything else did. It's got lots of raw might and some reactive moves. So far it still seems that they're doing very well, playing with a good chunk less stuff than they had before, but pretty well all the nerf datasheets still seem to be rather strong, and they might have a little bit less competition on the top tier armies, both sets of knights maybe being hit a bit harder overall after the rules changes have settled, and the Thousand Sons maybe getting treated harshly when they got hit quite so hard when the Death Guard didn't get anything further. Finally, and again on paper looking like one of the ones that should be doing rather well after the updates, are the Aeldari. They've maybe not been quite so standout on the tournament results, with around a 51% win rate over the past few months or so. Certainly not bad though, but where they were standout were the tournament victory stats. 17 event wins over the past quarter, and maybe kind of notably 7 of those seem to be after the Death Guard and Knight nerfs. It does feel like they've stepped up a gear, and Aeldari, when played to perfection by a good player, look like they've got a great chance of winning at the highest level. Their core mechanics have their battle-focused movement tricks. They generally tend to be fast, dangerous, and fragile if you can catch up with them, though you often can't with some move-shoot-move mechanics going on. The latest balance changes for the Aeldari looking like they were being in a strong spot really weren't so bad for them. Big units of swooping hawks went up, and while they were one strong unit, they were just one of many. The small squads are still very viable as well, and the small squads of Corsair Void Reavers, often used as sort of screening, trading units with a tiny bit of threat, they got increased by 5 points. As nerfs go, they're pretty tiny, they've got loads of things to fall back on, and they did get some buffs as well, maybe Azaman and the Dire Avengers being one of the most meaningful. Some people already like to use those with their move-shoot-move things, and the Avatar Wraithblades and the big squads of Void Reavers went down as well. The Avatar and Wraithblades maybe being a bit better at more casual levels, and a little bit more rarely seen on the competitive scene. For their standout strong detachments, it's generally been about the Aspect Host and War Host since Inari got nerfed, both usually supporting a fairly similar cast of Aspect Warrior units. War Host doubling down on battle focus and lots of movement shenanigans, Aspect Host having a few damage buffs for the Aeldari fighting elite, and both of them having a stratagem to allow them to re-embark with Wave Serpents, which can mean that a big squad of Fire Dragons or Dart Reapers can deal some absolutely enormous damage and then retreat to some fairly guaranteed safety unless the opponent can bring lots of force to bear on a transport that's likely hiding out of line of sight if possible. Beyond that, there's a good chance they could be joined by some more fire dragons, usually some banshees with an Autarch or Jane Czar. Warp spiders are nice for their sheer mobility, and maybe a squad getting the first strike in melee with Lycus. Swooping Hawks, Rangers and Void Reavers are all cheap for utility, striking Scorpions are usable. Storm Guardians might be used for some sticky objectives, maybe accompanying Eldrad Ulthuan to rustle up some command points behind the lines. If using a big 10 squad of Fire Dragons, Fugan might be along for the rise to give them a longer strike range. And there's plenty more things that are pretty usable beyond that, though that's a good chunk of the most common units in most armies. Overall, with those scary Aspect Warrior Alpha Strikes and good use of the detachment stratagems plus their battle focus options, seems like they've got enough tools to deal with the vast majority of armies in the game. Perhaps one of their biggest weaknesses being things like indirect fire or close range deep strikes that can jump in and threaten to down a bunch of Aeldari. If they're able to be hit first with a whole bunch of volume fire, they could potentially crumble. And most players don't seem to be achieving hugely above average results for them, but for the best players around they seem to be winning loads of tournaments. They certainly do seem to be in a good position going forward, given a few factions getting nerfs that are at their rivals. In any case though, let me know what you think down in the comments below. I'll be interested to hear your predictions for the coming 40k meta. What do you think is going to do well or badly? And how much do you think that the factions buffs and nerfs are going to be affecting things? That's about it for this one though. At the end of the video I'll just cycle back to talk about Titan's Terrain, the video sponsor, and their pop-up cardboard terrain system. Compared with most other sets around, it does feel like it's a terrain set with some more obvious bigger advantages and disadvantages. The main selling point is its portability. As mentioned, it can fold flat and go into a very small box, so not bad if space is limited at home or you want to take it round to a friend's house. It is far cheaper than a whole board of Games Workshop terrain, and is at least somewhat comparable with cheaper MDF offerings. It does have the advantage of not needing painting or assembly as well. Being ready to go immediately without wood glue and hobbying and spraying requirements might be helpful for those who don't have loads of free time and want to focus that on their armies. It definitely has some downsides and trade-offs though. It's certainly less sturdy and hard wearing versus plastic or MDF. It's made of cardboard and designed to fold flat, and it can mean that the ruins aren't particularly heavily weight bearing, so you might struggle to put models on the tops of them. The grid layout is a bit less flexible than some. You can shift things around and rotate the tiles, though I think it might not be the worst idea in the world just to have a few little extra walls and things to break up some of the firing lanes it can create. Though I've certainly heard good anecdotes it can do fine for a casual game of 40k. In any case, their sets will be linked down in the video description if you want to take a look at them. I've got a few different ones on offer. A Forgotten Furnace one, which is sort of like a Chaos Foundry, all glowing runes and factories and things. And then a more standard Ruined City Shattered Hive style one. A bunch of bombed out buildings and armoured containers and things like that. Maybe a more standard 40k style cityscape. For each of those they've also got an expansion and centerpiece set as well. 2 tiles pushed together that can make a big cathedral style thing, or an infernal spire for the factory. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring this one and helping make big videos like this happen. There'll be links down in the video description if you want to take a look over their stuff. I'll leave that there though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel, then there's the affiliate discount links in the video description, and also the channel's Patreon page. The Patreon page has a few advantages: seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize draws each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.